voices of dinner conversations all down the lake's mile length, sliding across the glossy surface only to rebound off the shore and swirl together in a confusion of murmurous babble. Now and then a weird inflection or wild laugh broke free from the hubbub and twisted up like a bottle rocket left over from the 4th. It was a relief and really a pleasure not to make out the words or even the coherent intonations of sense making and just focus on the hallucinatory far off din. Then slowly, as the dinner parties one by one dispersed, the voices dropped away until only a few remained, less alien sounding now. Then none, the lake itself a mind that had finally quieted its chatter, just as the first stars glimmered into being and a bullfrog started calling deep and steady. It's back in the first section of the book, before things get emotionally complicated. And it's just this poem that from the most basic, maybe impetus to write a poem, which is when you see something amazing and want to describe it and then see what else happens while you're writing the poem. In this case, it was kayaking into a cove near Cape Cod, and there was all this marsh grass on the edge, and the light was doing this incredible thing on the grass. It's very hard to describe, but I foolhardily tried to do it. It's also a poem about sharing experience. And there are a few of those in the book. I didn't realize it till I was putting the book together. That's basically what a poem should be too, a shared experience. So anyway, it's called The Light in the Marsh Grass. The light in the marsh grass was alive, small creatures aglow and crawling one after the other down each tall green blade. Thousands of them bending at all angles along the quaggy edge of the salt marsh cove the 3 of us had paddled our kayaks into. Luminous bits of green gold sliding down the myriad stalks, but inside them, as if the marsh were sucking down the warm light through innumerable living straws, drop after drop, in a wavering, steady, mesmerizing rhythm. And for once, no explanation we could think of. That unseen ripples on the cove's mirrory stillness focused the late sunlight in eely ribbons that scrolled down the blades of Spartina, could diminish the marvel we had chanced upon. And we gave up trying to explain it, gave ourselves to it, as if we had ingested some hallucinogen that opened our eyes to what was there all along but had gone unnoticed. Each of us in our own pod of selfhood, floating on the fetid primordial cove, now held together in odd suspension by these grasses, aswarm with lights that also flowed in waves through us, wanting it not to stop, asking ourselves why we'd never seen what had been going on for eons, asking how we could keep it, knowing we could not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. That was so wonderful. What a great reading. Your book is gorgeous. Congratulations on your poem in Poetry Daily and the review in Harvard Review. I've put the link for your book in the chat, and Martha Rhodes, our editor, has given everybody here a discount code. So when you get Jeffrey's book directly from Four Way Books, use HVWC 2020, no space. So please, everyone, get the collection. It's wonderful. I see some of you reading along with it. You already have it in your hands. Thank you so much for that great reading. Now I'm going to ask Ed to unmute as I introduce him. I imagine that most of us here today wait impatiently for each new collection by Edward Hirsch. Almost 5 years ago, we welcomed Ed and Emily Fragos to the center. And my students and I have talked about that reading and what we learned from it over the years, as recently as last week. So it's not hyperbole to say that we've eagerly anticipated his return while following publication of individual poems from this collection in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, and the Harvard Review. Stranger by Night was published by Knopf in the beginning of the pandemic. And what better time to read this collection that encompasses brief but important snapshots of a life. Hirsch's stunning combination of lyricism, reportage, and remembrance is evident throughout his 10th collection, which consists of 48 gems of lyric poetry, a perfect hybrid of elegy and memory. While several of these poems are tributes to famous people, a cancer researcher, and poets whom most readers will only know from work on the page, Mark Strand, William Meredith, Philip Levine, they transcend the individuals written about and for. They serve as both elegy for those individuals and for our own lost loved ones. Something we might write ourselves if we had his gift, not only his gift of language, but his gift of insight. Ed Hirsch praised William Meredith as, quote, generously looking hard at our common world. He doesn't slight the disastrous, the upteen kinds of trouble he has seen. Accountability weighs heavily in his poems, but his work reverberates with old-fashioned terms such as fairness, morale, cheerfulness, joy, and happiness. The same praise could be said of Hirsch and his work. He is a master at providing us slivers of life that stand in for the whole with such clarity and meaning that we finish each collection almost believing we know the man who wrote them. And isn't that part of the magic of all great writers? They make us feel as if they're speaking directly to us, even about us. When Fred Marchant performed my wedding ceremony in our friend's backyard 2 weeks ago, my husband and I chose a Mark Strand poem called The Continuous Life for Fred to read because it had been such an important poem to each of us separately through our adult lives. Hirsch's poem, In Memory of Mark Strand, captures both the power of Strand and the power of Hirsch as poets. Quote, we huddled together in the afternoon, quivering a little in the chill mist, muffling our sobs, looking up every now and then at the tall pines. We felt something lonely moving amongst us, a current almost, a small gust of wind, not a ghost exactly, nothing like that, but the ghost of a feeling, a shiver, which we might have missed altogether, except he had changed us. We were changed. Like the poets Hirsch writes about in his critical works and throughout Gabriel, Meredith, Levine, Strand, Hirsch has changed so many people. And through Hirsch's poem, The Radiance, and though Hirsch's poem, The Radiance, was written about a moment in 1984, it is apt for this moment as the country is burning and we wait impatiently for the election. We take refuge in moments like this when we lose ourselves in art. From The Radiance, when you tell the story of those years going up in flames, don't forget the radiance of that autumn, that day in autumn, burning out of time. Please help me welcome Edward Hirsch.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I think you buried the lead. Did you get married 2 weeks ago? Whoa, that's cool. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Just slip that into a poetry introduction. I don't think your husband's going to like that.
He won't mind.
Okay.
He loves
Congratulations.
poetry.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Wonderful reading, Jeffrey. I didn't think I ever would say that Freud underestimated the conflict with the father. But now I see, reading your poems, your wonderful new book. Really glad to be with you. I wish we could be there in person. I love Hudson Valley Writers Group and I love the train station. And it's just got a kind of magical feeling. But it is good to see everyone speaking from isolation. I'm going to read you some poems from Stranger by Night. Someone is sending me a note saying I'm not in speaker view, but does that matter? I didn't think so. I want to begin with a little poem by a 3rd century BCE poet named Nikonitos, which I translated. It's just 4 lines, but to me, they're very beautiful. Traveler, I am the grave of Baitan. If you go from Tyrone to Amphipolis, give Nicarachus this message. His only son died in a storm in early winter before sunrise. My friends don't get buried. I wrote this before the pandemic, but I think everyone is aware now of what it means when your friends died and there's no funeral. And my friends weren't having funerals anyway, oddly enough. And that's what this poem is about. There's a sort of cameo by 3 of them. One of them is Philip Levine in Fresno and Galway Canal and Sheffield. And there's a kind of in-joke about C.K. Williams because I refer to his tall ashes. If anyone of you know Charlie, he was 6'8", 6'9". So my friends don't get buried. My friends don't get buried in cemeteries anymore. Their wives can't stand the sadness of funerals, the spectacle of wreaths and prayers, tear-soaked speeches delivered from the altar, all those lies and encomiums, the suffocating smell of flowers filling everything. No more undertakers in black suits clutching handkerchiefs, old buddies weeping in corners, telling off-color stories, nipping shots. No more covered mirrors, black dresses, skull caps, and crucifixes. Sometimes it takes me a year or 2 to get out to the backyard in Sheffield or Fresno, those tall ashes scattered under a tree, somewhere in a park, somewhere in New Jersey. I'm a delinquent mourner stepping on pine cones, forgetting to pray. But the mourning goes on anyway because my friends keep dying without a schedule, without even a funeral, while the silence drums us from the other side. The suffocating smell of flowers fills everything, always. The darkness grows warmer, then colder. I just have to lie down on the grass and press my mouth to the earth to call them so they would answer. The black dress. I don't know why I opened her book almost randomly on a whim. It signaled me from the shelf after all these years, like a burning black dress tangled in the branches. Her dress. She was the one who was burning. And that's when the letter fell out. A love letter, sort of. After we'd given up on each other. Or did we? Our impossibility. But suddenly it came back to me in a rush. That night in Boston, a restaurant on the harbor, a storm simmering outside, that slinky black dress she was wearing. I didn't know she was burning inside of it. I thought it was the coming storm, summer lightning. I didn't know I was turning the pages of her book, her body, which I would read so closely. I wanted it so desperately. She was the fire. I didn't know she was already mourning for her childhood in the orchard, her lost self. Forgive me. I didn't know she was burning when she took off that black dress. Thank you, Jennifer, for referring to this poem, The Radiance, which is set in Detroit in 1984, my first college teaching job at Wayne State University. And there were a lot of there's two references in here which I like to think about. One of them is my friend Dan Hughes comes by on his stroller, and he was a poet and a Shelley scholar. There's a very amusing dream song dedicated to him called MLA. Then I was teaching a workshop, my first workshop, and it had a lot of students who were Ukrainian. And when they said something I didn't like, they would just start speaking. It's for speaking in Ukrainian, so I couldn't understand them. Kind of hilarious. The Radiance, Detroit, 1984. Late September in the shade outside of State Hall, that concrete brutality, where my students are smoking off a hangover and gossiping in Ukrainian, while Dan Hughes leans on his walker and talks to me about Shelley's bright destructions. I did not know it was indelible, the sun spangling the campus trees, the traffic thickening the smog outside the museum on Woodward, our voices rising. When you tell the story of those years going up in flames, don't forget the radiance of that day in autumn, burning out of time. Let's get off the bus in 1979 in front of the empty fairgrounds on 8 Mile in Woodward and stop for a few rounds at the Last Chance bar. The moon is tilted at a rakish angle, and we can toast the unruly poets of Detroit, praise our students who work 3 jobs and still show up for class. Don't get lost in the sad stories of the regulars, and make sure to step over the junkies on the corner and dodge the cars barreling past the stoplights for the suburbs. Let's surprise my wife, who's napping off her grief, and crank up the stereo for Stevie Wonder's road trip through the secret life of plants. Someone has started a garden on the far side of Palmer Park, or is it Woodlawn Cemetery, where we can throw a party for our friends. We're still alive. I suppose I must be coming to the ending of my rounding towards the end of my teaching life, because I've been thinking more and more about my first time teaching, my first jobs. And I ended up writing 6 poems here, I guess, a suite of 6 poems about my first teaching job when I taught in poets in the schools in Pennsylvania. And I was sent around to different towns, and I'd sort of move into the town and then go to the elementary school or the high school. I thought I'd read you a couple of these. This is called Whimber Field. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to bring Wilfred Owen's poem on the colliery disaster of 1918 to that tiny high school class in Western Pennsylvania. But soon they were writing about smokeless coal and black seams in the ground, the terror of fire damp, the rolling mill mine disaster in Charlestown, the closing of Whimber Field, the memory of standing in a wide ring around a mine shaft to watch a man emerge from the earth like a god, a father in an open cage, sailing across the sky. This borrows from one of those Cavafy poems where he wrote those poems 1909, 1910, 1911, Days of 1896, Days of 1901, like that. I love that sequence of his poems strewn through his work. And this is one for me that called Days of 1975. It started with the tattered blue secret of Basho, that windswept spirit riding my back pocket for luck. It started with a walk through the woods at dawn, mud on my new shoes, high humming in the trees. I was not prepared for the scent of freshly turned soil to pervade the empty classroom, or the morning to commence with a bell that did not stop ringing in my head. So many expectations filed noisily into the room. I was ready to begin. From the tall windows, I could see a storefront church opening on the other side of the polluted river. I remember walking past the rows and rows of bent heads, scarred desks, and gazing up at the endless mountains. In those hopeful days of 1975, I drove the country roads in honor of Radiance. O spirit of poetry, souls of those I have loved, come back to teach me again. I was really hoping to read my poems about working on the railroad and the railroad station. And I'm very disappointed to not be able to do that. Nonetheless, I'm going to read them for you anyway. This is called On the Engine. My book moves backwards, by the way. It starts in the present and it moves back in time, and then it emerges out towards the present at the end. So what I'm doing basically is I'm sort of showing you the way it works is I'm going backwards in time through all my jobs. And I had a lot of lousy jobs when I was young, and I'm sort of written a poem about every one of them. And so this was when I worked on the railroad as a brakeman. On the engine, you could almost forget you were coupling and uncoupling freight cars at a hump yard on the graveyard shift at Belt Railway when you rode south on the engine, slowly looping around the Chicago Loop at 4 a.m. with only the wind and the buckling rails for company while the city slept and the lake restlessly tossed and turned under a sky quilted with stars. The brakeman. He had a metal plate welded into the right side of his head from a drunken bar fight that he lost one night in 1963 outside the clearing yard, where he taught me how to separate freight cars at the top of the hump and switch them onto different tracks, chasing the runaways and scampering up the ladder to set the brakes and stop the bastards in their tracks, parking their bodies in the rust-colored air long enough to recouple, reroute, and reload them for shipping to Iowa or Nebraska or Colorado, the state of his retirement, the wide open country where it's possible to see for hundreds of miles and think clearly again and breathe like a free man in the mountains. And that's the job. That's the job, he said, shrugging his shoulders and running his hand through his hair like Dante or a spider who knows its web. That's just the job, he repeated stubbornly whenever I complained about working the night shift in 100-degree heat or hauling my ass over the hump for a foul-mouthed dispatcher yelling at us over a loudspeaker, or riding the cab of an iron dungeon creeping over bumpy rails to a steep steel mill rising out of the smog in Joliet or Calumet City, where we headed to track down a few hundred giants in chains clanking together on rusty wheels for dragging home and uncoupling at the clearing yard, loaded with empty freight cars, waiting to be loaded with more freight, because that's the job. This is called the Guild. It's about spending a life trading poems with people. And then you discover, it happens to all of us, I think, that many of the people you trade poems with for your whole life start dying off on you and leaving you alone without them. So this is about that. It's called the Guild. Goodbye to the years we spent leaning over badly typed poems, cramped studies in dank hotel rooms, half crazed, inconsolable, constantly jabbing pencils at each other, brooding, smoking on the balcony across from a temple on the other side of the river, one night in Rome, loyal or disloyal to the old gods, our flawed mentors, our weakness for standing at the podium, seeking applause, slashing lines, reciting Blake or Yeats, giving up sleep for late night sessions, listening to Coltrane, and gossiping about new books, and poets who've been dead for centuries, facing each other knee to knee, or sitting side by side over each fresh draft, furiously arguing about this enjambment or that illusion, mysteries of the craft, the muse, our shoulders touching, our voices growing hoarse with laughter, or walking out to the pier, a few yards from the sea, so that we could stand there together under the stars, alone with the abyss. Stranger by night. After I lost my peripheral vision, I started getting sideswiped by pedestrians cutting in front of me, almost randomly, like memories I couldn't see coming as I left the building at twilight, or stepped gingerly off the curb, or even just crossed the wet pavement to the stairs descending precipitously into the subway station. And I apologized to every one of those strangers jostling me in a world that had grown stranger by night. Baker swept by. You were already losing your eyesight last winter in Rome when you paused in the doorway at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and a baker swept by on a shiny bicycle, waving a cap and singing under his breath. You didn't know bakers wore white aprons dusted with flour and floated around the city like angels on a freshly baked day. You weren't sure why morning halted up and down the street as you stood in the doorway and a baker winged by on a weekend morning, so new and pristine that you looked into the sky and for one undiminished instant of misplaced time, you saw brightness everywhere before a shadow crossed the rooftops and it was blotted out. 2 more poems. And then I hope we can have a conversation. I would really like that. I walked out of the cemetery. I put down my prayer book and sifted through a wave of fresh mourners gathering at a nearby grave. I didn't stop to ask who had died. I didn't wait for the 8 pallbearers lurching toward us with a casket in their hands. I didn't even pause to wonder about a young woman lifting her veil and applying lipstick under a long-limbed sycamore by the side of the road. For once, I didn't look back. The dying goes on. It never stops. There was a new procession of black sedans winding down the lane, but I didn't hesitate to step around them on my mission to leave these hallowed grounds. I felt so liberated, I couldn't help waving to a group of teenagers listening to rowdy music, drinking beer in the parking lot behind the chapel. And finally, don't write elegies. Don't write elegies anymore. Let someone else stumble past the mausoleum and grieve under the calm shade of a plane tree, wiping away the tears of his ex-wife, staining the knees of his black suit, first sobbing, then choking back sobs, comforting others, consoling himself by scrubbing the white stone and weeding the plot year after year. I'm sorry. It's too sad. It's time for someone else to mourn my dead. Though who else can do it? I just need to lie here a while longer, face down in the soil, and then get up and breathe.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you to both of you, Jeffrey and Ed. We have a lot of applause in the audience, a lot of comments of thanks. We don't have too many questions yet, but I'm going to ask everyone to unmute or allow you to unmute if you have a question that you'd like to ask the poets today. You've been such a wonderful audience. Thank you all for being here. It's so great to see so many people. Again, in the chat, I put information about how you can order the poets' books. And we'd really love to see you all at the gala on October 30th. It's Friday night, and Jericho Brown, Toy Darracott, Catherine Hollibird, Susan Choi, and Leslie Jameson will be reading, and we'll be honoring our board chair, Don Stever, who's stepping down after a long stint as board chair. So hope to see some of you there on the 30th. Questions for Ed and for Jeffrey?
I can tell you a funny story while we're waiting. Someone complimented my accent, and it reminded me that when I was young and I started out, Studs Terkel had me on his radio show, and I was very excited. When I met him, he said, "Oh, don't worry. We can never sound too learned with accents like that." Still with me all these years later. Don't worry.
Mervyn Taylor has a question. All the way from Trinidad.
Okay, you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say, Ed, that I really loved your book, Special Orders.
Thank you.
That simple cover of cover with what looked like a shoebox. All right. But I wanted to add that my father too was a railway man, and when you talked about the coupling of cars, he got his thumb caught between the coupling one time, and so my strong memory of him is just that squashed thumb, the top of his thumb. Yeah. So thank you for those. I love those train poems.
It was a weirdly dangerous job because you're, if he was a brakeman the way I was, you're chasing cars that are moving pretty fast and trying to jump off them and uncouple them or couple them. And that must have been why he caught his hand.
I don't think he had any business doing it, but in those days, this is here in Trinidad, he was a railway conductor, but they called on you to do all kinds of chores, and so I think he wasn't quite sure of what he was doing, but he got his thumb caught between the coupling. Yeah.
The book you're referring to in Special Orders is the title poem is an elegy for my father, which is what you're reminding me of. And my father was a box salesman. He sold corrugated cartons, and that's why there's a box on the cover.
The box on the
box
great.
on the cover is
Great poem.
My father.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat. Would you please say more about the creative process of writing a poem? You commented that you can typically begin a difficult description for a new poem and then wait and see what happens. That coming in from Rosemary.
Is that for me?
It's for both of you.
Okay. Well, I'll go first. Ed will be more articulate, so I'll go first. Could you just repeat it again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Would you please say more about the creative process of writing a poem?
Okay, that's pretty general, but yeah, then the part about well, I think what I was saying when I was, talking about starting with description, which is just one of many ways to start a poem. But once you get started and you've got words on the page, other things happen between those words and those images. So you are led to places, hopefully, that you weren't expected to get to. And that's maybe the best feeling that you can have writing a poem. But starting the poems are sometimes, I mean, the other things I could say about starting a poem are, you know, sometimes you want to write a poem about something and you don't have a way in, and you don't have, and sometimes that way in is just a phrase, the right phrase to get the poem moving. It sort of inflects everything that happens afterwards. So it's like, I think of it as like the angle of entry. And then sometimes you get that wrong and you don't really like the results where it took the poem, and you can change that. You can find another angle of entry, another phrase to begin with. I mean, I like, Eddie's got these great ways of starting his poems, these little phrases that I could point some of them out, but he has some unusual ones in this book, with the negative imperative. Don't do this, don't do that, which that was a new angle of entry that I hadn't really ever thought of. But anyway, yeah, that's, but I mean, every poem's different. So you just, and sometimes they don't go anywhere. So you put it aside or you get rid of it. Anyway, yeah, that's some stuff.
I thought that was a funny way to begin a poem, because the don't was, I'm sort of like, one poem is called Don't Hitchhike. And as you read the poem, you realize that I'm talking about something I already did, but I'm like trying to instruct myself not to do it, but it's too late. And all the don't poems are all don't do this and don't do that, like To My 17-Year-Old Self or To Hitchhiking Across North Africa. They're all poems about mistakes you made, and you're telling yourself don't do it while you're describing what actually happened. And I thought that created a kind of resonance, along with the idea of like, let's get off the bus in 1979, where you're sort of on a transit, let's go down to the bio in 1981. It's like that. I think Jeffrey's right in his description, accurate in his description. I mean, I think all poems start differently, but and every poem has its own life and its own history, really, a sort of unspoken history or untold history. Usually it's too hard to write about relationships directly. And most poets, I think, don't begin. You might begin with a feeling, and you might have an obsession, and you want to write about something, but it's usually, you don't usually start by writing about the feeling. You start by writing about something more concrete, and hopefully the feeling will unfold for you in some kind of dramatic way. And that either is a memory or a detail or a description of something, a moment, so that the feeling will flow. And I think that the purpose of this, there are two issues related to this. One is writing the poem. The other is having the poem mean something to someone else. And Paul Valery has an extraordinary statement where he says, the purpose of poetry, please don't be scandalized by this idea, is not to inspire the writer, but to inspire the reader. And I think that the reason you try to hit on something concrete or dramatic or lively is because you're not just describing your own life, although you are trying to do that, and you are writing about your own feeling and your own experience, but you're also trying to communicate it to someone who doesn't know you. And so I think that you're trying to inspire the reader by finding some kind of correlative or some kind of external, or some kind of way of describing experience that it might mean something to someone else.
Yeah, along those lines, Moira has a question. In Jeffrey's My Father's Sweater and Ed's The Black Dress, specific objects carry power, memory, and entire stories. Can each of you speak to the point where that material becomes the emotional and how this feeds your poetry?
Who's going first?
I'll go first this time. I think that that's a very perceptive, I mean, the question is really a comment and it's very perceptive. I would say that the item takes on a kind of magical power, what the psychiatrist Winnicott called the transitional object. It has a kind of quality of mystery itself that sort of stands metonymically for the person. So Jeffrey's story about the sweater and his father is a way to talk about his father, but the sweater becomes the kind of correlative or the way to think through this. And in the black dress, I'm trying to get it that it's a kind of elegy. It's a painful memory of a relationship with a woman who is suffering in a way that I did not understand. And so the black dress seems to represent something that I can't quite articulate as I try to think through the experience and dramatize something about someone that I was in love with, who was going through something that I didn't understand. And so that was a way to try to think through it and dramatize it. Jeff?
Okay, well, with my sweater, I mean, that poem, I guess you could call it an object poem, but it really had to do with the encounter of finding the sweater. So it just kind of took off from there. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to write about things. Sometimes, you know, you can write an object poem that tries to sort of make the object strange. It's more in the surrealist tradition, maybe, where maybe you're writing about a telephone and you turn it into like an underwater creature or something. But this kind of poem is more, the object is imbued with all this history and emotion and, you know, freighted with a family history or whatever. I mean, so it's a whole different thing, but I think Eddie's right, you know, writing about the sweater is a way to write about my father.
And also in a poem that you didn't read, Jeffrey, the gorgeous poem about the photograph that you can't find of you and your father, and hoping that one day it will fall out of a book. It reminds me of that as well. And
yeah, that's the absent object. So yeah, I mean, that photograph exists and it's somewhere. So.
We also have a very general question about why do you write, and how do you know when a poem is finished? We could sit for hours with that one.
That's two different questions, but yeah, when a poem is finished is kind of hard. I mean, sometimes I think it's like, I think when Bishop ended at the fish houses, she said she felt 10 feet tall. I think probably she knew it was finished. Usually it's not as clear. I mean, you know, Valéry, if we're going to keep quoting Paul Valéry, he said a poem was never finished, only abandoned. And but you don't really know. Your friends can help you, your poet friends. Yeah. Eddie, do you have?
I mean, one thing is, you know, you finished when you start wrecking your own poem.
Yeah.
By overdoing it or turning it more, or sometimes you're just helpless. You're like, there's nothing else I can do this. When you're working through formal problems, that helps, of course, because there's a poem is a kind of, well, William Carlos Williams called it a machine made out of words. There's a kind of machinery operating. And so when you're working through a form, whether it's a nonce form that you invent or a form that you're working through that's prescribed, the working through the form is part of the problem of the poem. And so partly a poem is an emotional experience, but also it's a kind of problem solving, and it's a formal problem solving. And so when trying to formally solve the problem, sometimes when you've resolved it in a way that makes sense to you, you feel that poem is ended. I mean, a lot of the poems that I read today were one sentence poems. So I kind of took the sentence as far as I could take it while dramatizing an experience. I mean, I didn't write it off in one sentence, but the poem is revised endlessly to make one sentence. So you're working within the confines there of what you can also do in terms of your limits and your possibilities.
Yeah, some of mine were one sentence. I know marsh grass is one sentence. Yeah, it's kind of just nice to try to keep a sentence going.
Yeah.
When you were speaking about the danger of wrecking a poem, I was so impressed by both of you, how layered your poems are. And I had actually wanted to ask before, but I guess at a certain point you can go too far, but ask about your process of revision and if some of that layering comes about in revision.
Very much so. I mean, writing poetry is revision, really. I mean, it is every once in a while you get lucky, but mostly it's a way of thinking through and rethinking the problem. And I would say there's superficial revision and then there's deep revision. And the superficial revision is just the changing of the line breaks or the working out of the lineation, or the metaphor, all kinds of things that go into formal operations of a poem. But in a more complicated way, sometimes the poem really demands a deeper thinking. And the revision is the thinking through of the consequences of the relationship, of what you started with and what the poem is giving you, so that you go further than you thought. And I think you're trying to push yourself in a poem to surprise yourself, to discover things that you didn't really know or understand. And since you're probing often painful material, because I personally believe that poetry is like psychoanalysis, you're supposed to go where it's painful. Because of that, there's a lot that consciousness wishes to slide by. And so revision is a way of holding yourself, keeping yourself to task, holding yourself to account, forcing yourself to encounter and re-encounter what the experience really is about. And for a poem to work, something has to work on a formal level, but something also has to work on an emotional or spiritual level. And so the revision is the keeping of accounts and the thinking through the consequences of what this means as a kind of human statement, as well as a work of art. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't even need to say anything, but because you said it all. But yeah, I agree that there's so many kinds of revision, and there's also subtractive and additive revision, like where you take things away. You don't need this part, but then there's the additive kind where you realize you're not doing enough. You want to push it further and go further into the idea or the concept or the emotion and see what you find.
Let me give you an example from the history of literature. I've been reading the drafts of Langston Hughes's book-length poem montage of A Dream Deferred. And in that, he has a famous poem called Harlem, which we all probably know, called What Happens to a Dream Deferred. But I was amazed to discover that was part of a poem, the next poem in the book, called Good Morning. And it's about someone in Harlem remembering where he's born in Harlem and how the neighborhood has changed and how all these people have come into Harlem from Haiti and from Cuba and from Puerto Rico. And Harlem has really changed, and they arrive from the train station and they get up there, he's saying good morning. And then right in the middle of the poem comes What Happens to a Dream Deferred. And then it's exactly the same poem, except it's in one stanza. And here you'd say Hughes, as in revision, understood that the poem, he could break these poems into two different poems and sequence them. He could make Harlem a single poem because it had its own authority, and that he would put it into stanzas, which he had not done. So that seems to me a kind of, the poem itself, the book is very improvisational, and he was working fast and thinking through something. And then he got this idea. And it seemed to me by dividing these two poems into one poem, dividing one poem into two different poems, he found a way to highlight what is one of the most iconic poems now in American poetry. So that was interesting to me to see the process of something coming up in a writing, and then you see that actually this deserves to stand alone. This deserves to be by itself, and it has more power alone, and then make this other stuff. He doesn't lose the other stuff, Good Morning. He just divides it up into two different poems and then changes the poems. So sometimes you're working through, you have too much material in a poem and you realize that you're taking away from the poem, from the kind of emotional education or experience of the poem. And so it's better to save something and turn it into two different works of art.
Yeah, related to that, I mean, it's not directly related, but sometimes you're writing a poem and you've got it and you think it's finished, and you realize, I mean, this has happened to me where you suddenly realize that if you just get rid of the last stanza, this line at the end of the penultimate, that what was the penultimate stanza, which you hadn't thought of as an ending at all, starts to feel like an ending, and maybe a better ending than with that other stanza. So that kind of thing happens too.
Sometimes I think you try to close too hard. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
As you
And I think that
overthink it.
when you go, you can overwrite, like you were talking about before, start destroying the poem by overwriting, or make it starts to seem, it doesn't seem natural anymore, or it seems kind of wooden.
Also, I'd say you want a poem to be finished. And so sometimes you just decide it's finished or you can't do anything more. And my own experience is that if things continue to bother you over time, you know something is wrong. Now, in my own experience, I try to ignore it because I've really done all I can and I really don't want to do anymore. And I've kind of had it with you. I've had it with you, poem. Go out on your own in the world. I can't handle you anymore. But the point is that something is bothering you and you know there's a reason that it's bothering you, and your unconscious is telling you something, and you have to listen to that. And so you return to the poem. And sometimes you can't finish it because you don't have the formal chops. And sometimes you can't finish it because you're not emotionally ready to confront what the experience is. I think we've all had this experience, if you've been writing a long time in your life, that there are things you try to write about over many different years and many different times because you only have one life. And there are experiences that are formative to you. And you try to write them about, but you can't. And then at some other point, you keep trying at some other point in your life where you're a somewhat different person, you're able to look back and dramatize this experience. So for example, the poems that I wrote about teaching in Pennsylvania poets in the schools, that experience happened to me in 1974 and 1975. I've had a whole life teaching poetry, but I never wrote poems about teaching those kids. And I didn't know why. And I didn't know why I suddenly could write them when I was writing this book. And that's when it occurred to me that, and something I said to you, is that I probably, when I was making my way all these years, I wasn't very interested in that kid who was teaching poetry to kids in Pennsylvania. That wasn't so, I was interested in the kids, but I wasn't interested in myself as a teacher very much. And so the experience was not something, although I liked to talk about it and thought about it, it didn't seem like something for poetry, and I didn't know how to write about it. But now, as I've been going over my life in teaching and thinking about what it means to teach, that kid who started out with all those hopes, teaching poetry with a kind of wild excitement, that kid became interesting to me again. And in a way he'd never been before. And so I felt, let's see what happens if I write about, teaching these kids from the coal mines in Pennsylvania, from coal mining families in Pennsylvania, and see what happens. And something unleashed for me or unlocked, and I was able to do it. So that was just very interesting to me about the mystery of writing poetry, in terms of something about writing one sentence poems and something about coming to a certain point in my teaching life was it enabled me to return to the past in a kind of dramatic way that seemed interesting, and that I could make something out of it in poetry.
We have a question here from Rebecca Dover-Spike, one of our wonderful SHP poets. And she wants to know, do either of you ever feel that language leads through you rather than you as agent of the poem?
Well, that's what you want to happen, or you want to, it's sort of like you're writing it and it's writing itself too. I mean, if you're really, we might be talking about first drafts here, but yeah, that's you know, that's the goal maybe. I mean, you're following, one thing about that is you could be following a metaphor, you could be you're following what you're saying, but you're also following the sounds and the metaphors and how you're saying it. So you're doing a few things at once. And so you can be sort of cruising for a little while. I mean, very, very slowly. I tend to write slowly, but all those things, the sounds, the metaphors, and what you're trying to say, maybe the event you're describing, can propel the poem forward so that it's not just this act of will. You don't want it to be just an act of will.
Well, in fact, it can't be. I mean, in his defense of poetry, Shelley says, not even the greatest poet can say, I will compose poetry, because poetry is never entirely at the dispensation of the will. So I think you're always hoping in some way that you will be the conduit for something. In the history of poetry, this has often been figured as the wind. So like D.H. Lawrence says in Song of a Man Who Has Come Through, not I, but the wind that blows through me. And I think that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the wind that blows through you. In Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, it's creator and destroyer. And I think that you want, at your highest or at your greatest moments, you feel as if that's happening to you. Now, ever since Romantic poetry, and Wordsworth, we have this idea of inspiration that's a little different, that it comes not just from outside of us, but something that is from inside of us. So you're kind of praying to something that's inside of you, but you're praying to something that's inside of you that you hope will be unleashed, that you don't know, that you don't understand, that will know more than you know, more than your consciousness knows, and will enable you to say something that is meaningful and stands in some kind of formulation of experience.
But then there are these writers that claim to be like Edgar Allan Poe or Paul Valery again, like they act like they're completely sort of rational, and every decision they made for a reason. Like, I mean, I forget the name of that essay that Poe wrote about that.
Well, I mean,
I never really believed him. I don't really believe that essay.
Well, I think you understand that there's a kind of dialogue that you're talking about in poetry between the unconscious and the conscious. And Paul Valery and Poe in this case are making the extreme case that they would rather know why everything is in a poem, all the pulleys. Poe uses the imagery of stage managing, all the pulleys and the camera and the curtain and everything like that. And they say they'd rather write a lesser poem in which they know why everything is there rationally than a greater poem in which they don't. Now, to me, that means that they're extremely afraid of the unconscious. And you can see why Poe is afraid of the unconscious, given what his unconscious must have looked like. So there are poets who, like the surrealists, who pretend to be completely autonomous, who they invented automatic writing. And then when you look at their manuscripts, you see that they were cheating and that they often revise their poems. And then there are poems on the other side of the scale who believe that nothing is unconscious. And I think most of us think of the poet as a kind of maker, as someone who makes something with an awareness that you can't control or make everything, because your poetry does have an element of irrational thinking or emotional thinking or unconscious thinking. It's a kind of associative logic, not a rational logic, which is one of the distinctions, I'd say, between poetry and philosophy. And it's what I would call poetic thinking. Keats calls it non-consecutive reasoning. And so you are trying to balance between what you know and what you don't know what's conscious and what's unconscious in the formulation of a poem. And these poets who are on the extremes, like the surrealists on the one side and the hyper-rationalists, like Dr. Johnson or Ivor Winters on the other, are sort of instructive to us about where we stand in the relationship between the irrational and the irrational in the making of poetry. I feel so relieved to be talking to you all about poetry and not just the news. Mostly I'm just here brooding by myself. It's nice to see everyone.
I know, I really meant it before when I said that this is a real respite for everyone to be able to think about something else other than the news and politics for a couple of hours. Everyone in the chat is thanking you so much for this and for this great discussion. Let's see, Nick McCoa, one of our wonderful SHP poets, says, how do you recover from writing a collection? That's a good question.
It's funny. That's funny. Jeff?
Well, I'm so slow putting one together that by the time I get it together, the poems have been around for a while. But then you've spent so much time figuring out how they fit together and how the manuscript fits together. And you do kind of get to a place where you're not in the zone to write them anymore. And you have to find your way back somehow. I guess that's the only way I think about it as a recovering.
Sheila, yes, my name is Judith. My last name is Carr, C-A-R-R.
Judith, please mute yourself. I'll mute you. There you go. Sorry, going.
Hi, Judith. She's calling to correct you, Jeffrey. She doesn't agree.
Yeah, sure.
The way you finished your books is not, she thinks otherwise.
Yeah.
I think the question implies something that strikes me as true, which is you spend a very long time on a book of poems. It's very hard to write. You do finally come through to something, and then you formulated it and you don't want to do that again. And so you do face a kind of void or abyss, a kind of emptiness as you try to figure out what to do next. I mean, some people just go on and write the same thing again. There are poets who are incredibly productive and just write and write and write. And they're not better poets, but they're happier people.
Yeah.
That's my experience. If you think of like Jerry Stern or W.S. Merwin or Adrian Rich, they're happier. I mean, they just wrote a lot and they went on writing and they never got stuck. It wasn't all good. In fact, it often gets pretty bad, but they're happier. And if you look at the other side, the people who write very little, who are great poets, like say, Philip Larkin or
Bishop.
Elizabeth Bishop, they're often very unhappy because they're spending tremendous amount of times not writing. Now they're great poets, and they everything they do is, I mean, it's a gift to you because when it's done, it is a great present, but it makes you a little miserable. And I think most of us are somewhere between that. We're not on the very few side. We're not on the write little, do it well, nor are we on the sort of crazy Whitmanian side of endless numbers of poems that keep spilling out of us. And so if you want a book to be a single collection, if it is an experience in itself, which is what I think, that is, you want a book to be more than just a group of poems. You want it to be an experience in a kind of Rilkean sense. And if you want that to be true, then the next book has to be something different. And it has to take time, and it has to sit inside of you, and you have to figure out what you care about. And at a certain point, something troubles you so much that you begin to write again. Not because you just want to write poems, but because something is on your mind, or some experience has troubled you, or you're so desperate, which is what often happens to me, to try to articulate something that you begin to write. And I mean, another question is, I think related to this, is how do you start a new book, which is kind of, the answer is blindly.
Mm-hmm.
Which is you don't know what it is. You don't know what a book is going to be until you're well into writing it. And then at a certain point, it seems to me, it begins to formulate itself and you begin to see what it might do and how it might be shaped. But initially you want to see what that's going to be. And so you sort of write individual poems or try to write individual poems and let them live for a little while and see how they come together and how they build into something that's on your mind. Thanks, Nick.
Great question, Nick. Other questions? Can raise your hand and I'll unmute you.
Hey, Henry, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in so many years, Henry. It's so nice to see you.
Likewise, Ed.
Where are you?
Santa Fe.
Cool.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a question. It came to mind during Ed's wonderful poem about trading poems with friends, fellow poets. And it's an experience that is hard for people starting, I think, in workshop. If you're a student in a workshop, this is hard. You develop a relationship with your poem where it's a territory that you feel you know better than anybody else possibly could. And so then you sit down with one of your knowledgeable friends, not a mentor maybe, but just maybe a colleague. And this person reads the poem and says something that strikes you as completely loony, as if they just could not possibly have understood the poem at all. They want you to take the third stanza and trade it with the fifth or something like that. And so you say, well, I'll think about it. But you don't think about it. And you go home and 2 weeks later, you do think about it. And you think, my God, that's right. Why didn't I know that? That's what friends are for.
Yeah. That's great.
Sometimes you never change your mind though.
Yeah, that's right.
Sometimes, but I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a very good observation, which is naturally, I mean, I don't know how you are, but if I finish a poem or I think it's finished, I kind of like dig in. Like if someone like tells me, I think this is really good, and then someone says something and then I'm initially irritated.
Sure.
And go, you don't know anything. And I used to get in these fights with Janet and we thought of millions of ways to try for her to read my poems where I wasn't just like looking over her shoulder. It's horrible to read someone else's poem. Sometimes your friends have something to say that really does seem off the point. And Phil Levine used to frustrate me with this because he didn't really care much about the form of the poem. He was more interested in the experience. So if you like wrote a sonnet, he just like would give you the manuscript and cross out a line and like screw up the rhyme scheme. And he like, isn't paying any attention to that. I'm like, what? But this other thing you're talking about, Henry, is another way to see it, and that you rethink your own poem, that someone sees something into it that you didn't see about it.
Exactly.
And that other perspective really turns out to be very helpful once you're not dug in anymore. And you can rethink it as an experience. You're lucky when you have friends like that.
Indeed.
The corollary of that is that it's much easier to talk about what somebody else's poem needs than your own.
Yeah, it's very easy to see in your friends' work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can be stubborn.
I think that the thing that you're pointing to is when someone gives you their poems, you're often trying to figure out what they want from you. And the question is, do they really want criticism, or do they really, and are they looking for something line by line? Or are they looking for some overall? Are they looking for some just response? And it can be hard to figure out sometimes. But you're lucky if you have really solid friendships where people can tell you the truth about what they think, and then you can decide what you think about that. But it doesn't help to just get yourself reflected back. And that's what you're talking about, Henry. A different view that later comes to you is realize that this this is correct.
Yeah, Jeffrey, when you came to talk to my students, one of the things that a lot of them loved was when you said you gave a whole pile of poems that you had written over a couple of years from your previous book, that you wrote between your previous book and now, and said you gave it to a friend you really trusted and said, okay, you know, what is this book about? Because a lot of my students weren't writing these theme oriented concept books and had just a lot of poems and didn't really know if that was something that could be considered a poetry collection. So that gave them a lot of encouragement that that you just wrote a lot of poems without necessarily having a driving topic.
Yeah, I think you find it as you go. I mean, I remember that day, and a lot of those students really seemed to think that you had to start a book with this major concept. And there are poets who do that, but I mean, most of us start out blindly writing one poem at a time and then gradually find our way to what we're doing, the way Eddie just said. But yeah, that was funny. I was happy to you know, disillusion them of that concept. Yeah.
And speaking of my students, one of them, Jim Garber, just said, will either of you come to teach a class at HVWC someday via Zoom, if that's easier? I won't put you on the spot now, but keep that in mind that you have people wanting you both to come to teach a one-day class.
You know, I think the question about that you're bringing up about your class when Jeffrey visited with the idea that it needs to begin with something very big is a kind of misconception. And that's really common amongst younger poets. And I think that you see that as a poet over time, you begin to realize you have to trust experience and you have to trust your own experience. And you can't write someone else's poems. You have to write your own poems. And I think a lot of people feel that their own lives aren't worthwhile enough. And so they feel that they should somehow jack it up or lift it in some kind of way. And to me, that's a mistake. And to other people, your lives seem extremely interesting, especially when you write about it dramatically. And so I think that the idea that your life isn't enough and you have to goose it up in some way with more significance is probably a mistake. And that the more crucial thing is writing with authenticity about the life you've actually lived. If you think about, say, a poem like an elegy, which at some point everyone in poetry will write, more than one, I'm afraid. The key thing to me in the elegy is that the person who's writing the elegy does not misstate the relationship to the person who's died. Most people, I mean, there are two ways to go wrong in an elegy. One is you sentimentalize the person who's died, which is a mistake. Another idea is you overstate or misstate your relationship to the person who's died. It seems to me that readers suss this out. And so it's very important that you establish with some precision what your relationship is to the person who's died. And authenticity here is more important than meaningfulness in terms of you don't have to be the closest person to the person who died. You just have to have some relationship to the person who died. I first learned this thinking about a poem by Theodore Rutke called Elegy for Jane, My Student Thrown from a Horse, which you all may know from the anthologies. The thing about this is it's not a great poem, but the thing that's really powerful at the end of it, he goes, I with no rights in this matter, neither father nor lover. And that's really very powerful because usually the elegy is for the lover or the father writing to the young woman who's died. And he's aware that as the teacher of the young woman, he doesn't really have a role. It's unnatural for the teacher to write about the student as opposed to the student eulogizing the teacher. He makes a good pun on rights, R-I-G-H-T-S and R-I-T-E-S. But it also taught me something about the ritual nature of the elegy and where you stand in relationship to the person who died. And that seems to me more important than overstating the significance. Not that the person who died has to be an important person, nor do you have to have been the most important person to that person. But you're looking for some kind of emotional honesty. And that's why I think Jeffrey's poems, for example, about his father are so powerful, and his poems about his brother, because they give us that kind of emotional honesty that is somewhat discomforting, but very powerful in poetry. I'm getting all wired up.
Other questions? You can raise your hand. I'll unmute you. I'll make sure that both poets get the chat, because people are extremely appreciative of not only the reading, but also of the discussion and the talk about craft that they've heard here today. It's been really inspiring. We're just so grateful to have been able to share this time with all of you. And you've been a wonderful, wonderful audience, as usual. But really, it's so great to see all of you today.
I think Diego has a question.
Diego, okay, I'm going to ask to unmute.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, so this question was already a little bit answered, I think, by Edward in by the last question. It was specifically as someone who like just discovered poetry, who's 20, and has become really obsessed with it, if either of you had any specific advice for a young person, maybe like a 20-year-old version of yourself.
I would say read a lot of poetry, and not just what's being published right now, but go back and read the great poets, and yeah, just read and read and read, and then write too. But the reading will lead to writing, perhaps. I'm sure.
You won't thank me for saying so, but there has been no great poet in the history of poetry who is not a great reader of poetry. I mean, you might be the first, but so far it hasn't happened. I myself don't think that reading everything is quite so crucial as finding some things that you really care about and responding to them. Personally, I don't have a strong feeling about who that is. Like, to me, I don't care if it's E. Cummings or Edna St. Vincent Millay. I mean, what matters to me is that you find something that you really, really care about and respond to and enter into some kind of conversation with. And once you enter into that conversation with another poet who's not alive, or alive, but I think more strikingly not alive, once you do that, you enter into a kind of conversation with poetry itself. And you know that we write poems because of our own lives and because of our own experiences, but once you begin writing poetry, you also enter into the stream of poetry. I hope you would go and read a poem by Constantine Cavafy called The First Step. It's a beautiful poem, and it's about what you're talking about, the very first step that you take in poetry. And in this poem, which I don't have in front of me, but Cavafy invents a conversation between Theocritus, the first pastoral poet, and a young poet he makes up named Evmenes. And Evmenes goes to Theocritus and he says in Cavafy's poem, the ladder of poetry is too high. This is too much work. I've written only one idyll, I-D-Y-L-L. I've written only one idyll and already I'm thwarted. And then what Theocritus says, or Cavafy has Theocritus say, is, this is blasphemy. What you're saying is not true. That poetry is a noble enterprise. And to already stand on the first step is to become a citizen in the city of ideas. And what you have done is a noble thing. I love this poem, and I love the idea behind it, which suggests that there's something noble in writing poetry, in entering into the conversation of poetry, not just about your own experience, but with other poets. And so I think when Jeffrey says read a lot, I think what's behind that, what he means is enter into poetry, join poetry, find a way to talk to other poets and think through other poets, because there's a conversation going on in poetry between poets. And I don't mean just poets who know each other. I mean poets who are responding to each other, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. I mean, you don't have to go very far in reading the modernist poets to see that William Carlos Williams is having a crazy, enraged conversation with T.S. Eliot, because he thinks that T.S. Eliot has destroyed American poetry and put it back in the classroom for 25 years. And Williams is like shaking his fist and responding because he thinks poetry should be more American and be something different. Once you read that, you understand that you have a position, you want to know where you stand in this argument. You start trying to figure out, what do you think? What do you think? Like, how American should your language be? Should it be really Augustan like Eliot? Or should it be really vernacular like Williams? And so when you start reading them in terms of your own work as a poet, you find that there's a lot for you to decide about. And then you become more conscious, because once you try and decide, well, just take the question of how vernacular your poetry is going to be, are you going to try and transcribe more closely what Williams calls the speech of Polish mothers? Or are you going to like try and stand higher above and create something more Augustan or distant? And so this kind of decision will make you so much more aware or conscious of your own vocabulary in poetry. And once you do that, you'll start using language in a different and more charged way. And I think that will help then distinguish what linguistic register you want to write in. And as soon as you get into a conversation this way with other poets, you will then start articulating what you think and what you believe and why you believe it and who you want to be more like. Like, do you want to sound more like Ezra Pound, or do you want to sound more like Emily Dickinson? Or do you want to sound more like Marianne Moore? I mean, there are a lot of possibilities. I myself, in my 20s, just around a little older than you, started turning to poets from other countries as a kind of alternative model. I started to hear something in other poetries that I didn't hear in American poetry. And it was very exciting for me to discover that. But that's really for each poet to discover for yourself. And I think that's a kind of excitement. And so instead of being discouraged that you can't know everything or read everything, you start somewhere and you go, Rilke is my poet, or Rilke is not my poet, or I understand that Rilke is a great poet, but I much prefer Pablo Neruda. And you begin to see who inspires you, who interests you, who gets you to talk back to them. And you become aware of formal problems as well as emotional and personal ones.
There's not much to add to that, but just to say it in a different way, probably more briefly, these decisions that Eddie's talking about, I think are going to be a lot easier when you, in your reading, one or two of these poets are going to feel like they're speaking directly to you, like you know them. And those are going to be maybe your poets, at least to start with. Like you really feel like, I know this person, I know where they're coming from, I like this language. So they're just speaking, you'll just feel like a more powerful connection to them. And others you won't. So, that's how you find your way through what Eddie's talking about.
Amy Holman says, Edward Hirsch, don't stop teaching. I think we can all agree with her on that.
Nice to see you, Amy. It's nice to see you. I haven't seen you in so many years. It's nice to see you.
Cindy has a question.
Hi, so good to see both of you. This is such a response from everything. I have a question that's been turning around in my head for years. When I first started showing my poetry, like to anyone in the 1960s, my first comment was from a criticism was from a teacher who said to me that in the poem, I say too much, leaving very little for the reader to do. And that comment is always in the back of my mind every time I think I want to add a line or I haven't said enough. What do you think about that line in terms of what you have to leave out so that the reader has something to do?
Well, there's the whole show don't tell philosophy, which there's a lot to it. I mean, we do have this temptation to explain ourselves sometimes when we don't need to. Although there's definitely room for statement and saying things directly in poetry at the right moment. But if you're saying that you feel that this voice is impeding your writing, then I would watch out for it and maybe just forget about it for a while and see what you write without that voice. So it's hard to know exactly where you're coming from with that, but those are the two sides of the issue, maybe.
I mean, there are long poems and there's short poems, and there are, they're explanatory poems, like say Robert Pinsky's explanation of America, that are, discursive. So I think that I can only think that what someone is telling you is that you seem to be explaining away something, therefore losing its power. That you're telling us too much about about what you think about something rather than dramatizing the experience. We can't say because we don't know what your poem is about, but my own experience with young writers is that it's possible to take away from the drama of a poem by over-explaining what you mean. Whereas the reader really has to figure out what you mean. A poem is not, you don't want to be lectured to in a poem. You want the poem as a dramatic experience that you can enter. And so sometimes when you feel that someone has told you too much, it's because you feel lectured. But when you read, say, John Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, you don't feel lectured, and you don't feel that he put in too much, even though it's an incredibly full poem, and filled with minor details like what he ate for lunch and what street he's on when he's walking around. But you do feel a kind of mind at work. You feel there's a kind of consciousness that's operating. And since that's what that poem is about, you don't feel that there's too much in it. So I think the question is really, are you trying to explain something away or tell us too much about it instead of as a kind of quest to understand something? And I think as a reader, whenever a writer is like trying to figure something out, to understand something for themselves, I don't think you ever feel there's too much in that. But when you feel that the writer is trying to, bully you or hector you, or a writer has a kind of design upon you, you don't like that. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the trouble with a lot of didactic poetry. This is the problem with a lot of political poetry, where it puts the writer in the position of knowing everything and the reader in the position of being a dumbcuff. And I much prefer Borges's strategy, where he writes as if he doesn't entirely understand the story that he's telling. And he said that was something he learned from Kipling. But I think Borges is a better writer than Kipling, but I think it's an interesting idea to tell the story as if you do not entirely understand what's happening. And that gives you a kind of feeling of quest rather than over-explanation. And maybe that's what this is addressing.
We'll take one more question because we do not want to take advantage of these two generous readers who have spent so much time with us today. So if anyone has one last question, something that we haven't covered yet, maybe.
It was really nice to see everyone.
Or we could just thank everyone, and we can take ourselves on mute to give a big round of applause for these amazing writers.
Wonderful.
Wonderful to see everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you. That was so much fun. Thank you, Jennifer.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to see you.
Oh, good to see you too. Thanks a lot. That was great.
Great evening, guys. Great.
So enjoyable.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.